Testing, 1, 2, testing, making sure this is working. Clove. Sony and Fujifilm. That's one of the bigger questions in the photography world, and people sit there debating it back and forth in Facebook groups, in Flickr, on Reddit. It's everywhere. It's kind of ridiculous. But when it comes to actually working with some of their flagships, they have a lot of similarities. Some are better, some features are worse. It really depends on the type of photographer that you are. Take, for example, a core set of 3 cameras. There is the Fujifilm X Pro 2, there is the Fujifilm X-T2, and there's the Sony a6500. All 3 of them have 24 megapixel APS-C sensors. All 3 of them have some sort of weather sealing. All 3 of them are also over $1,000, but underneath $2,000. And all 3 of them have very, very good image quality and very, very good features. So which one is actually right for you? Excuse me. This is the Fujifilm X Pro 2. It's a pretty awesome camera. Rangefinder style, got a lot of really cool dials and more dials and even more dials. It's pretty wonderful. Has a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor right at the heart. Can use a lot of really amazing Fujifilm lenses. There's a lot of great things to this camera. The one thing that a lot of people seem to hate about this camera is the fact that the ISO dial is, well, to me it's not weird at all because I'm a film shooter, but to a lot of people it's really, really weird. This ISO dial, in order to actually change the ISO, you have to lift it up and then you have to slide it. And people go online and they complain about this nonstop. It makes no sense. It's really, really simple to do. There are no major problems about it. It's designed to have a film shooter's aesthetic. It makes a hell of a lot of sense. That's why you have this aperture ring. Who the hell complains about an aperture ring? No one. So you honestly really, really shouldn't be complaining about this. It's really good. Then there's the fact that this camera has both an EVF and an OVF. For photographers that really like optical viewfinders, this will make a lot of sense. Then there's weather sealing built in. While I was testing this Fujifilm 23mm f2 lens, I actually took it out in the rain. This camera got thoroughly soaked. We put images of it on Instagram, and a lot of people were like, holy crap, I would never do that with my camera. And I said, well, this actually isn't even my camera. It's on loan from us from Fujifilm. This isn't my lens either. But actually, none of the lenses that I own are weather sealed, and none of the bodies that I own are weather sealed. So it works out, and that's my job. I have to sit here and I have to test these things. Overall, though, I really, really like the ergonomics of the Fujifilm X Pro 2 because it's rangefinder style. It reminds me a lot of working with a Leica or something like that. That, and when you have a camera strap like this, it becomes really great to use on the street because you just do this. 1, 2, 3. Boom. Great. Easy to use. Doesn't fall. It's great. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. Next up is the Fujifilm X-T2, which a lot of photographers will really, really like if they like the DSLR style of camera bodies. I'm not a major fan of SLR style camera bodies. Actually, most of the film cameras that I own are rangefinders with the exception of some really, really big Mamiya bodies. This camera, though, will appeal to a lot of photographers because the ISO dial is on the side right here, so no reason for you to go on Reddit and complaining about it. And then there's the shutter speed dial over here, an exposure compensation dial over here. So all of your exposure controls are really right up top, in addition to the lens being right here. The Fujifilm X Pro 2 has more or less the same thing. This X-T2 is slightly larger than the X Pro 2 because it has 4K video capabilities. Now, the reason why it's slightly larger than the X Pro 2 and the X-T1, is because they needed to have more of a heat sink in order to actually compensate for the fact that they have 4K video shooting capabilities. That's why it needed to be just a little bit larger. That kind of makes sense when you think about it. It's a workhorse camera. There's a lot that really comes to it. Even though it's a workhorse camera, there aren't a lot of things that make it great for videographers, unless you're actually buying the external grip that you can then put on the bottom, because then you have much better control of being able to shoot video and listen to the audio, kind of PJ style. By that I mean photojournalistic style. How tough is this camera? Believe it or not, I actually went around with our curation editor, Anthony, one day while we were photo walking, dropped the camera with my 35mm f1.4 lens attached, and the screen shattered. But the camera still works with no problems. So the screen is really shattered right around there. I actually cut myself on it accidentally, but the camera still works. There are no problems. My lens has a little bit of astigmatism, but that'll get fixed soon enough. This camera is also very weather sealed. It's said to be as weather sealed as the X Pro 2, and considering that I've put the X Pro 2 through hell and rain here in New York, I'm actually very confident that the X-T2 can stand up to everything else that the X Pro 2 can. So what would people like about this camera? It's got a little bit more of a grip, which is nice and very comfortable and ergonomic, and in addition to that, the thumb rest is also very nice. You can really kind of shoot, I want to say Nikon style, really, because of the fact that, like, you have your shutter speed here, and if you want, you could probably set this to, like, actually, you can't really set that to control your aperture, and then you have your ISO control right here. It makes a lot of sense. If you're a Nikon shooter and you want to go to Fujifilm, this would make a lot of sense for you. Then there's the fact that the articulating LCD screen goes up and down, and it's really kind of cool, actually. It's very standard in a way, but it works. The Fujifilm X Pro 2 does not have that articulating screen because of the fact that it's really a camera that doesn't very much need it. I think in the next iteration of the X Pro 2, though, that it probably should get it because it will allow a street photographer or any working photographer that likes to use the X Pro 2 to really exploit it to a little bit more of what's possible. Otherwise, you could buy one of these and also buy an X Pro 2 and kind of just switch between. If you want something a little bit more low profile, then you have the X Pro 2. If you want something a little bit more workhorsey, then you have the X-T2. Actually, Fujifilm does call the X-T2 its workhorse, or at least a few reps that have talked to me personally do say that it is. Last on this list is the Sony a6500. This camera is more affordable than both Fujifilm cameras, and is arguably more capable. My problem, sort of, with the a6500, and all the bodies like this ever since the Sony NEX7, is kind of the weird take on rangefinder style camera bodies. So you have this exposure control dial right here, and then you have another one back here. But if you are a Sony A7 user, then you are used to one being here, and another one being here. And you don't have that with this camera body. Why? I'm not exactly sure. It would make a lot of sense if Sony put one right here. Because then I'd be able to control my shutter speed, my aperture would be right here, and my ISO would be right here. It would be a serious workhorse camera. It is already for a lot of photojournalists and a lot of video shooters, but it's just an aesthetic thing, I guess, for me. Then there's the viewfinder that's very nice. The grip is actually very nice overall. It's just trying to actually choose some of the settings and manipulate some of the things kind of makes no sense to me. What Sony did do, though, is they added a touchscreen capability to this. And it works out pretty well, providing I can actually activate it. Whatever. And then, the weirder thing about this, actually, is that you can't actually use it to access certain things on the screen. You can only really use the touchscreen to try to get through things like choosing a focusing point while you're shooting. So when you have the camera up to your eye, you can kind of switch the autofocusing point, kind of like this. That has happened before, and it's kind of weird, but it works out pretty well. That's something that a lot of Olympus cameras do, and it's something that a lot of Panasonic cameras do, but with Olympus cameras and Panasonic cameras, I usually like using the directional pad in some way, because it just helps me have more precision. Sony's camera bodies are indeed very sturdy. They don't recommend taking them and running them under faucets the way I have with Olympus camera bodies, and actually Fujifilm doesn't really say that you should either. But I have taken this out in the rain before with a weather sealed lens, and it has been pretty okay. My sort of issue here is that Sony has this 24mm f1.8 from Zeiss. It was one of the first lenses that they introduced for the E-mount, and it is still an exorbitant price. I've seen it for over $1,000 still, and yet Fujifilm's 23mm f1.4 is nowhere near $1,000. It just makes no sense. This lens is probably 4 or 5 years old at this point. It just makes no sense. Sony's ergonomics, otherwise, though, are actually pretty okay. I tend to think that Olympus and Fujifilm have better ergonomics overall, even with the Sony A7, which this is actually being shot on. I love the A7. I liked the A7 II series, but I didn't feel that it was enough for me to actually upgrade. A big thing that I really want from Sony is a little control stick right here for me to be able to change my autofocus points. I'd love it, Sony, I really would. So how difficult are these cameras to really use? Honestly, Fujifilm kind of takes the cake here. Sony has these menus that then lead you to sub-menu and page after page after page, and Fujifilm doesn't really do that. Granted, you have a lot more control with the Sony camera than you do with the Fuji camera, because they can do a lot more things. When I say Fuji camera, I actually mean both the X Pro 2 and the X-T2. There's a lot more customization with Sony than there is with Fujifilm, but you can actually do quite a bit still with Fujifilm. Most people will actually find it to be pretty okay. In terms of the actual use with ergonomics, Fujifilm wins by a landslide. Fujifilm and Olympus, I feel, have the best ergonomics out there. This is wonderful to be able to do this, and then to be able to do this, and then I have no problem doing this at all. I never have had a problem. I also don't change my ISO very often. In terms of actual photography and the history of it, you weren't really meant to change your ISO very often. You were meant to change your aperture very often. You were meant to change your shutter speed very often. ISOs these days are actually very good, but still, I mean, this is a camera that is designed for a certain type of photographer that really tries to lock in their ISOs. They don't really need to change up their ISOs very often, and as it is, I mean, the shutter impact on this is very, very slight. I can shoot down to a 1/13 of a second and actually get blur-free images. I've actually really done it. Fujifilm overall is easier to use when it comes to the ergonomics and actually in the menu system. I really, really wish Sony would actually try to do a little bit more. At every point, I feel like somehow or another Sony moved something that was very important to me. Like, for example, with the A99 Mark II right now, the format function is in something totally different than it is with the A7 and with the A6500, and it makes no sense. And in addition to that, too, the A7, which I've been used to for a while, it's easy to activate IAF, which when you're shooting a portrait will use face detection, and then you press this button and it finds the eye on the face and it focuses immediately on that eye. And if you have vision problems the way I do, it's fantastic. It's the most wonderful thing out there. But with the newer cameras, it's kind of tough. I mean, with the A6500, you have to sit there and you have to program it. It's kind of weird, and same with the A99 Mark II. So what about autofocus? Well, this should really be no surprise. When it comes to focusing in really, really low light situations, I actually feel that the X Pro 2 and the Sony a6500 do an incredible job. For some odd reason, I don't know why, the X-T2 couldn't really always focus perfectly in the same really, really low light situations that I put the other cameras through. It's still accurate, it's just slower, and I'm not exactly sure why that's happening. When it comes to working with the newer lenses like the 23mm f2 or the 35mm f2, that's where Fujifilm is really at its fastest. It's great for street photography, for candids, for weddings, for whatever. It really doesn't matter. Photojournalism, they're pretty great. They're very fast. With the Sony a6500 though, you're going to get slightly faster autofocus performance and arguably better AF tracking performance. I actually feel that the Sony a7S Mark II and the Sony a7R Mark II have better AF tracking when it comes to working in tracking modes and with native lenses. The a6500 is okay, but it's not what the A99 Mark II is at all. That thing's a beast. When it comes to autofocusing with Fujifilm cameras, the tracking AF isn't really so perfect. It can work, but I mean, the lenses are really designed with this push-pull mechanism that lets you really fine-tune your focusing with manual focus or with zone focusing or something like that. And if you're doing street photography, it's probably better that you use that functionality. Although, there are street photographers that use Fujifilm and actually do get images sharply in focus with very little issues. Sony takes the edge very slightly when it comes to autofocus. And now for the part that you're all really super concerned about. The image quality. Keep in mind right now that Sony took 3 iterations of the 6000 series camera to actually be able to output image quality that is on par with the Fujifilm X Pro 2 and the Fujifilm X-T2. Both the Fujifilm X Pro 2 and the Fujifilm X-T2 before the a6500 delivered files that were better at high ISOs at 6400 and above, had better color rendition, had better high dynamic range. It was perfect. It was really incredible. And I don't know why Sony wasn't able to do this earlier. I think part of it has to do with the processor. That would make a lot of sense, but now when I actually look at files from the Sony a6500 at 25,600 ISO, I'm really impressed, and I've showed it to other photographers in clubs that I'm part of, and they're all super impressed at what it can do. It's really incredible. Plus, when you set it to like daylight white balance or tungsten white balance, it actually kind of looks like film. They did a really decent job. Where Fujifilm kind of takes the advantage, though, is the fact that they have built-in, baked-in camera profiles. So if you're working in Lightroom, for example, or you're working in some other software except for Capture One, sadly enough, you can actually take the camera profiles that Fujifilm gives you for Velvia, Astia, Pro 1400, the other one, Acros, etc., etc. You can take all those and you can apply them to your image. They'll look pretty good. Otherwise, you can work with the files in Capture One and actually just get better files than you probably would in Lightroom anyway. So just keep that in mind. All 3 are actually very good when it comes to image quality. They're all capable of getting a lot of detail out of the highlights, a lot of detail in the colors, and do really well when it comes to high ISOs. When it comes to the Fujifilm cameras, I feel like, generally speaking, the X-T2 will kind of lose more detail in the high ISOs, even with noise reduction off, but you'll get cleaner high ISOs. With the Fujifilm X Pro 2, though, you will get something very slightly noisier, but you'll get a more detailed file. Personally, I'd like a more detailed file. I will work to actually nerf the noise myself. I can do it in Capture One, or I can actually use something from a company like MacFun and use Noiseless Pro and get rid of some of the noise. It's really a fantastic process, and they do a great job. When it comes to working with the Sony a6500, though, you also do get really great high ISO output. There's nothing really to complain about with all of the files from each of the cameras when you're looking at the image as a whole. And when it comes to printing, though, I probably wouldn't print something larger than maybe legal size or something like that. I wouldn't do something like a 17 by 22 when it comes to anything above ISO 3200 or maybe even 6400. I'd actually wager more 6400 is what I do. So what's my personal favorite of these cameras? Honestly, they're all really good. If you give me any of them, I'll be able to make great images with any of them that you put in my hands, and I'd really have no problem or troubles doing any of that. When it comes to ergonomics and feel and just feeling like something is a companion camera, I'd actually go with the X Pro 2. The X Pro 2 has these wonderful ergonomics that I really, really like, and it has more than good enough image quality, more than good enough autofocusing abilities. It's really quite good. My issue, though, with the Fujifilm system overall is the fact that I cannot shoot a lot of video with it, and it won't give me a lot of versatility the way that Sony will. I also cannot use a lot of third-party lenses. Zeiss makes a few in the 2-it lineup, and there's Rokinon and a few other random brands, but not really a whole lot for Fujifilm. Sony, on the other hand, has a lot more. There's Sigma, there's Zeiss, there's Tamron, there's Tokina, there's Rokinon, there's a lot more. There's also great third-party support for flashes. Sony has third-party support from Flashpoint, from Godox, from Impact, and then they have their own actual flash radio triggers. Where is that thing? It's right here. So it works pretty well. Fujifilm doesn't really have that, though. And if there are people that say that you don't really need a flash with Fujifilm cameras, I want to strongly disagree with you. I actually think that flash is a wonderful creative tool that actual creative photographers can use to create photos, not capture things. You can totally use them to capture something at a wedding, but the idea between creating and capturing is something that's far different. You can also do it with a manual flash if you want to, but I would like to be able to also have the ability to use TTL whenever I want to. It just makes sense. As far as my personal choice for any of these cameras, that's really tough. Honestly, I own an X Pro 1 right now. I have no major reason to want to upgrade to the X Pro 2 or the XT2. Both of those cameras are very good, but they're not exactly what I want still. It's not in terms of image quality. It actually has to do with feature sets. I'm not exactly sure why Fujifilm doesn't incorporate both sensor shift stabilization and lens shift stabilization. It does make a lot of sense. They are arguably the best APS-C makers on the market, even though they don't make, well, designers, rather. They design their own APS-C sensors. They don't make them. They do a good job. And then there's just the whole fact that their cameras are kind of romantic to work with. They're just wonderful. They seem to complete you or the owners in a way. It makes a lot of sense. If you haven't tried a Fujifilm camera, you really should give it a lot of thought and try it out for a while. I have staffers that don't really like Fujifilm cameras, they like Sony cameras, and I have staffers that don't really like Sony cameras, but they like Fujifilm cameras. So it's all over the place, but both camera systems are really good. They're not totally doing everything that I want at the moment. Fujifilm is trying to with the medium format camera system, but it's not this. I don't understand why Fujifilm didn't make their medium format camera system a rangefinder style body. This is the Fujifilm GW693, and it's incredible. It's a rangefinder, and it's fairly bright, and it has a 90mm f3.5 lens. Plus, it's 6:9 format. So, like, look how large that negative is. It's massive. 35mm sensors are probably that big versus all this. You get a much better image from this. And I love this, and it's wonderful. But I don't think anyone is really doing anything to majorly excite me right now in digital. And I know that I'm not the only one that feels this way. There are other photographers that feel this way. They're all making great cameras, but no one's making a super exceptional one. if I had to, once again, choose any of these three, it would probably be the X Pro 2. But it also really depends on the type of work I want to do. If I want to do more video work, I'd probably actually reach for the a6500. If I want to do more stills work, the X Pro 2 and the a6500 do a great job. The XT2 is kind of this weird in-between ground. When it comes to ergonomics, the X Pro 2 is awesome. When it comes to autofocus, the Sony is just a little bit better. There's a lot. They're all good. Really, the best thing to do is to actually go out there and try it yourself. Alright, I'm done rambling. I'm done talking. Thank you for checking this video out. Please subscribe to the Phoblographer on YouTube. We're trying to actually do more videos, and we're actually working on a podcast that's going to be coming out soon. So, thanks a lot, guys. Take care.